Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Andrew Yang and the summer 2019 Hong Kong protests and what actions those events demand from Andrew Yang now. Okay? All right, so of course Andrew Yang is he's paving a path to the White House, and right now in real time, events are happening in the world, right? Like the world doesn't stop because America's having a U.S. presidential 2020 U.S. presidential primary Democrat race, right? So this is happening in real time in Andrew Yang's real world, right? And I'm looking at this, and I really think these very much demand action from Andrew Yang, a specific action. I'll define what that is. But let's talk about this situation. So, summer 2019 Hong Kong protests. So basically, the protests have been going on all summer. The people in Hong Kong have been protesting against the Chinese government, right? Two countries, one system, two countries, right? And basically, people in Hong Kong have, because of these protests, they now have 5 demands, right? They're saying the laws for extradition, the proposed law for extradition from Hong Kong to China has to be a no-go. Cannot do it, right? In addition to that, they're saying that the police that have been involved in these protests. And by the way, the reason why we're talking about this today is these protests have gone from peaceful protests to non-peaceful protests, right? That has happened. That's already out of the gate, right? But so one of the 5 demands that these protesters have is they're saying, hey, we want these police that have been involved in handling these protesters, we want them investigated by the state, right? Like, that's a huge request in China, right? In addition to that, they are saying that the protests need to be specifically categorized as protests and not riots, even after they went non-peaceful, right? And the reason why these protesters are saying that is they know if these non-peaceful protests that have occurred, right, are categorized as riots by the Chinese government, those protesters could be in jail for 10 years. 10 years in a Chinese prison. That is not good. You ain't that's not playing around. Like, that is serious problem. They are also asking for the resignation of Carrie Lam. Carrie Lam is the chief executive of Hong Kong, and they're saying, hey, we need her to resign because she is not representing us the way we want to be represented. And they are asking the fifth and final demand is they're asking for all protesters anyone who was arrested in connection to the protests be released. Now, when I hear those 5 demands, I hear fear, right? Like, the people of Hong Kong are fearful. They're fearful of the situation they've gotten into themselves just by protesting. There is a ton of fear, from the Hong Kong protesters about the Chinese government. You can hear fear in these demands, right? Now, those are just the demands that have come up since they've started protesting. Why did they start protesting, right? Well, the high level basic demands of these people in Hong Kong is freedom, personal safety, right? And rule of law. Freedom, personal safety, and rule of law, right? That's why those Hong Kong protesters, those freedom fighters, and you can call them freedom fighters now, right? Because we have transitioned into non-peaceful protests, right? This ain't a Gandhi situation anymore, right? Like, this is a very American situation, right? We had some non-peaceful protests too, leading up to 1776, right? Now, when that happened, right, we were like, hey, we also need, so the Americans, between like 1756 all the way up to 1776, we were like, hey, you know what we could use? Freedom, personal safety, and rule of law, right? Like, our demands were exactly the same, right? So Andrew Yang now is looking at this situation, right? Now, what does this prompt from him, all right? So one, he knows that the second he gets in office, right, which is going to be January 20th, 2021, he's got a huge problem, right? And basically, there is a pot brewing right now in China, and these Hong Kong people are becoming freedom fighters, right? People who are fighting for freedom, personal safety, and rule of law. Exactly the same things that America was fighting for, right? And when we had this situation, we had somebody who said, you know what, I'm not going to do a Tulsi here. Lafayette from France was like, oh, bet, my American brothers and sisters need help. I better get my butt over there and save them, right? Like, and make sure that they get freedom, personal safety, and rule of law, right? Like, and honestly, right now, Andrew Yang is going to have to decide, right? Do we aid these, one or two, there's only two paths. There's only two paths, right? That's all Andrew Yang is going to have when January 20th, 2021 hits. And guess what? This problem is going to be there day one. And him getting in could absolutely trigger needing to know the answer on day one. You know how I know that? Because I know history, right? And in 1980, when we had Jimmy Carter as president, and when we were going to Ronald Reagan, right? There was a considerable number of American people who were kidnapped, right? Like, who were American people who were being held overseas, right? Literally the day that Reagan got into office, people were like, oh, crap, we're not dealing with the next peanut farmer here. We better give those people back, right? So when power changes hands, things change fast, right? So Andrew Yang is going to need to know the answer to these two paths on day one, right? So what are the two paths? We aid these freedom fighters. We say, hey, we have not forgotten the face of Lafayette. We know that our nation exists because somebody said, no, I ain't Tulsi Gabbard. I'm not going to non-intervention and watch while people who need freedom, personal safety, and rule of law, we're not just going to sit by and watch them idly and do nothing, right? We're not going to do that, right? Lafayette helped us, right? So Andrew Yang is like, do we take the Lafayette path, right? That noble American path? Or, all right, now, here's where it gets real, all right? Scott Garibay, I'm all about the Lafayette path, right? But I am voting for Andrew Yang for a reason. That guy is wiser than I am, right? And I want his answer to this question. What's the second path? What path might Yang choose? He might respect Chinese sovereignty. Say, you know what? It's the Chinese government. It ain't our business. We're going to let those people, they're going to have to, that's it. They're going to have to do it on their own. There ain't no more Lafayettes. America has forgotten the face of Lafayette. We have forgotten, our debt to humanity and to freedom and to personal safety and to rule of law. We have forgotten that there was one brave man in France who aided this nation, right? And brought a whole bunch of other people and helped us get where we needed to be, right? But the reality is, the reason why that I'm mentioning this second path is if we aid those freedom fighters, I'm a smart dude. I know what's going to happen, right? If we do not respect Chinese sovereignty, that absolutely opens the door for international skirmish, right? And I remember some international skirmishes too, right? It happened between 1910 and 1950, and it was pretty freaking impactful for the world, right? And that's where we could end up with this situation. If we help those freedom fighters, we could be absolutely looking at a situation where we have an international skirmish on day one of Andrew Yang's presidency, right? Now, I think it's worth that. To me, Lafayette path all the way, right? But the reality is, I'm not asking Andrew Yang to prepare for a Lafayette path. I am asking for him to think about this, to give this situation, to give these two paths Mindshare now, okay? Now, he's in the middle of a presidential run, right? Like, he can't be sitting around all the time thinking about China, right? But he can think about it 2% of his time. That's what I'm asking. I think that Andrew Yang right now should give 2% of his mind share over to this Chinese problem, because we're talking international skirmish at the level of what happened, of the two that happened between 1910 and 1950. Right? This is a problem. This is real deal international policy, right? This is for, all the marbles, right? We've got to get this right, right? And the reality is, I already know the answer in my heart, right? But I don't want that to be applied. I want the answer that Andrew Yang brings with his double Ivy League brain and with his compassionate heart and with his wisdom, right? Because he's smarter than me, wiser than me, and more compassionate than me. And I want him to give 2% of the mind share, 2% of his mind share, even in the middle of this presidential election, because it's that important, right? Now, what does 2% of mind share really break down to, right? Well, the reality is, there's 16 waking hours in a day. If you take 3 days, that's 3 times 16, that's 48. That's close enough. Call it 50. That means every 3 days, Andrew Yang needs to give 1 waking hour of thought to this. He needs to get on the phone with international policy experts from the red. He needs to get on the phone with international policy experts from the blue, right? This is we're looking at international skirmish which we ain't seen in like 80 years, right? If this goes wrong, right? But at the same time, right, we can't forget the debt this nation owes to freedom fighters. We were freedom fighters at one point, and Lafayette did not forget us. And the question now is if we forget him, right? But at the same time, China is its own sovereign nation. Do we respect that over these freedom fighters? It's a deep question, and to tell the truth, I already have my answer, but I don't want my answer to stand. I want Andrew Yang's answer to stand. And when he gets there, when I put him there, right, with my vote, and you put him there with your vote, on January 20th, 2021, I want him to have that answer already figured out, right? And I know that's a tough ask. I know that's a tough ask to be thinking about international policy level at this deep. But I wouldn't be voting for him if I didn't think he could do 2 incredibly difficult tasks at the same time. Figure out an international policy issue that's happening in China right now and run for president, right? He's a great man. He's got a compassionate heart. He's got a great brain, and he has wisdom. And I want him to apply it to this very, very serious question. All that is my opinion. I'd love to hear your opinion on the matter. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.